I came out of the Air Force late in that year, so that with all the GIs that had returned, they filled up the colleges, and so I had resolved that I'd have to wait a year and get in on the following September. Well, my father, I came home one evening, he said, I just saw a little blurb in the Time magazine that talked about a new college opening up in Vermont.
I picked up a Time magazine and I was reading it, I think on the train. And there was Walter Hendricks sitting on a pile of lumber and it said, new school, new college beginning, you know. So I got on another train and came up and looked it over and signed up right then and there.
And I think it was on Sunday, I called the school, just happened to catch Walter Hendricks in that little building that was the admissions office, and got him on the phone and told him that I liked what I read about the place and wondered if there were any openings that I wanted to make a transfer from the city of Philadelphia. We talked for a few minutes and he said, well, give me a minute, let me see. And I joke to this day that he probably walked to the other side of the room and stuck the phone in his pocket and came back and said, we just happen to have one student that's not coming back, and so you could take that bed if you wanted to. And I said, well, how about a transcript and that type of thing? He said, well, just come on up.
I graduated from high school in 1949. My father was in the Marine Corps, and I wanted to go to college, but he decided I should go to secretarial school. So I went to secretarial school from the time I graduated until January, and I failed everything in secretarial school because I hated it so much. And he announced to me that he had just enrolled me in what was primarily an all-boys school, but that he talked to this man called Walter Hendricks, and together they decided that they would make it co-ed with me.
My first impression was, this is loosey-goosey. This is a place where I think this feels good. I think Buck Turner was the person who was there and took me around. Smoking and talking and, well, this is, what it is. And there was just this general sense of, we're really interested in what's real.
I married it. My father-in-law was the first chairman of the board. Anyway, I asked Walter if there might be a berth for me in his new college. I knew that he wasn't going to be able to pay much of anything, and that he wasn't going to be able to field a full complement of teachers. He would kind of scratch together what he could, which is what he did.
Well, you came first.
I came first, and there were very few of us. I mean, we had one dorm, that was Mather, and I lived on the third floor with a roommate, and then the second floor had boys in it, and then the first floor had boys in it, and that was the total capacity of the college. There was an administration building, and there was a girls' dorm, and we had a very informal, as it still is, dining hall, where it currently is, even in 205. And there were 3 tables I think we set up for lunch and dinner, and that was it.
I had an old high school friend that had been going to Bennington at the same time I was there, though a grade behind me, and she didn't show up for the fall term when I was at junior, and she was a sophomore, and it turned out that she was enrolled at Marlboro, so I visited back at 4th and decided to transfer once again, and was student. Everybody was very flattering to me. I really wasn't that great a student, but everybody was saying, oh, you're so smart, it'd be great to have, another student who can actually do college work, terrific, why don't you transfer? And so, wonderful, you know, I felt very welcomed. So I did, and Buck was on the faculty, and after, you know, I was only a student for a year and a half then, till I graduated, and we were going together from the first summer I was here.
When was it? It would have been probably late spring in '47. I was working in my dungeon lab down under the physics building at the University of Chicago, and this man walked in that I'd never seen before and introduced himself as Walter Hendricks, and he would like me to come and teach physics at the new little college that I probably had heard about. Well, you can guess the rest.
I was here for 4 years, but did not graduate. I didn't complete my thesis. But Dave Lovejoy gave me an extension, which I'm still on. So that's the present status.
I don't think you could peg a certain type of person that came to Marlboro even back then.
No,
they were
definitely.
diverse. You know, I think of the kids, some of them from the city, some of them veterans, some of them, you know, sort of wandering, not sure what they were going to do. Yeah, it was strange. But exciting, I thought.
I remember as if it were yesterday, the first day that I came to Marlboro College. It was in July of 1956. I drove up the hill, and the campus, as you know, was just a few buildings. Hendricks House, Mather House, the administration building, the music room, and the blacksmith shop, the library, Dalrymple. That set of buildings.
I have very vivid impression, and I was 8, going on 9, of driving into Marlboro in my father's 1938 Auburn Accord. Walter Hendricks met them somewhere, I don't know where, in the center of Marlboro, perhaps. He directed them to where the college was going to be, and there was nothing there except the Dalrymple farms. And he stood up and he said, "This is all campus." And it just says everything about who Walter was. This vision was fully realized in his mind.
And the first sergeant was going home, and he said to me, "They're starting a university in Biarritz, France, for students with not enough, GIs with not enough points to go home. Would you like to go there?" He was a buddy of mine, so he put my name down, and I found myself going in a boxcar across Germany, across France, ending up in Biarritz, where the Army had taken over 90 hotels in this beautiful resort town on the Atlantic, took over every hotel, every guest house, and formed an impromptu university by bringing over some of the top professors from America, and immediately, and we would get complete college credit. I think it was 16 weeks. You could take any courses you want. I wanted to be a writer, so I took English. The head of the English department was Walter Hendricks, who came from the Illinois Institute of Technology, the Armor Institute. He was head of the English department. And Walter always talked about someday starting his own college. He was so impressed at the Biarritz experiment of a college being just started immediately. That
when he came back, he said, "The Army can start a college, I can."
Oh. Yeah, it was great.
Because they didn't have the educational background, they had organizational skills. But the professors who went over from all sorts of colleges and there were civilians in uniform. And they were the ones who really set up and ran the college. They had to find books and rooms and everything. The Army didn't have anything for them. Yeah. The concept, we don't want to send the soldiers back to have everybody suddenly arrive in the US, let's give them college overseas. Mm-hmm. And they started one at Biarritz and one at Oxford.
Like Hendricks, I wanted to relive the Biarritz experience of being in a new college and something like that. And small classes had its appeal then, although I didn't realize how small some of them would actually be.
The beginning of the summer, my father came back from Biarritz. You maybe are clearer on the dates there, but I remember we were here and on the porch and returned, and I suppose had driven somewhere, my mother maybe, to pick him up from the ship, whether it be Boston or where. And he gathered us all together and for a little family conference and said, I want to share with you a thought. How would you feel if I were to give up everything and start a college here? And we were excited about it.
Well, Walter had a major dream of having this college in an area that he had known for many years.
Thought he was a kick. He was about as un-Vermonty as one could get. He was from Chicago, and how he got that property and that whole thing, I don't know.
Well, he obviously had visions of what he wanted this place to be, and the fact that many of his ideas are still here proves that some of them were good, and that the faculty that he chose, or that subsequently have been choosing themselves, still follow those same ideas.
He said that really his ideal was to run a college for the love of learning. That would have been his ideal. No competition, no grades. But somebody couldn't just do that. You see, but this was an ideal that he had.
The whole piece was about 650 acres, or 640 acres, I think, which I think is essentially a square mile or something. And originally there were three brothers, the Mather brothers, and the house that's called Hendricks House was where we lived. It was the last one built and the most solid so that they could move in right away.
Hendricks lived next door. He acquired this property here, which had the barns of different sorts. There was this big cattle purpose barn up here. There was a small horse barn down below, which was converted to the original, what was our first library, actually. And also was used as an admissions office. I guess it still is in a way.
Yep, it is.
But I guess it was used by horses. I remember when it was initially remodeled, some of the beams were showing you to see, the timbers, which had been chewed by horses that might have been chopping out of at some point.
The main house where the office was there, bedrooms were there, everything was in that one building. And then as time went on, they kept adding things and whatnot. And chicken coops suddenly became classrooms.
When this barn was converted for a dining hall, then it was temporary partitioning into three classrooms. There were two modest sized and then a larger one. The middle one was a larger one. These were used for a couple of years.
It was only after the college started that he finally made the last payment on the mortgage. In order to get the college started, Whittemore and Persons and Z. Persons and all were intent that the college had collateral, had assets, and my father gave a big chunk of the property with all the buildings to the college. And then with Whittemore and I guess a loan through the bank and Z. Persons, they were able to get by Saratani's property, which is next door. And then, so that was the original campus.
And I've been back a couple of times, and I must say it's always something a little different every time you come back. Either a new building or something's different, but you still have the same. It's a place you get attached to it a little bit, even though you don't want to admit it.
Dr. Hendricks certainly was the greatest scrounge around. He got all sorts of war surplus material, and the stories about that are legion, I guess. But he brought all sorts of things up to help out with the college. He bought a generator and desks and all manner of things like that.
Arthur was just the same as he had been in Biarritz. He scrounged all of the cots from an armory in Springfield, from army bases that being closed down. He scrounged all the sinks and all the showers, all came from army barracks or someplace. But Hendricks taught courses in addition to being president. He taught Chaucer, he taught short story writing, he taught the novel, and I think I told them yesterday that you'd be sitting in class in this building next door, in the dining room, with little classrooms in it. Hendricks would be teaching Chaucer's The Miller's Tale. Somebody would throw up a window, as a cement mixer went by, yell at the driver, tell him where to deliver the cement, then close the window again and carry on the class. But Hendricks was building a college and teaching at the same time. He was really an incredible person that he could do that.
Walter Hendricks was almost desperate to fill the place up. You know, it was not time enough to really do a good job of selection or anything. And the Army U.S. military, the Bill of Rights, GI Bill of Rights had come into being just shortly before that, in which they promised veterans to give them a virtually free college education. They would pay for their college education. So this was a source for Mr. Hendricks to mine. And so predominantly, the student body was predominantly GI Bill of Rights. They were technically a co-ed college, I guess, but essentially so it wasn't a men's school for the first 2-3 years. It was little in the way of women.
First female, I guess, who lived on campus, which happened to be in the Whetstone Inn. And I got a roommate, Sarah Moore, and it was the two of us who lived on campus. That was our dorm.
At that time, they had, by 48, 49, they had enough students so that they had some housed at what is now the Colonel Williams, which was Eames House. And so there was a bus that went from there to the college.
A group of students lived there, and a little bus picked them up, then picked us up, and took us to the college. Then the little bus would come, take us back to the inn, and take them back to Eames House.
There were some guys from prep schools that had a pretty good background, and some of them were living in tents out back, but they were already working on the place. Showers were still being completed. The walkways up to the school were just muddy little trails, and the buildings themselves were still being finished off.
Certainly the first summer before classes began, there were a group of students here who were painting buildings. I was painting buildings and digging ditches, and my brothers were, and students were integrated into the functioning, the operating of the place right from the beginning.
The basic dining hall, Dalrymple, outdoor program, that and the administration, and those houses were the nucleus at that point. And the first building, the new building was the Howland House. That was the first new building, I think, on the college. All the other buildings were the original farm. And Howland House, the dormitory for the girls, was the first building.
So the dorms, halfway house, and everything else came much later. The dorms up on the hill came later. The library, obviously, very much later. The music festival came in the, early 50s? I think so, yeah. And so that transformed things a bit, because they built the big shed, of course, and then the music practice building off to the side. And I forget when Apple Tree must have been there, but I don't remember what we did with it.
That first building that was built was a generous gift from Weston Howland, who was a trustee of the college, and therefore the first building happened the year we graduated, 59. And before that, there wasn't a new building built on the campus. It was still utilizing the old farm and those various buildings.
In the early days of the college, at least as long as Walter was here, the work program was a substantial part of the education. All the students took every Wednesday afternoon, and worked physically. And of course, during most of those first couple of years that I was here, a lot of the work was on Dalrymple, what's now Dalrymple. It's called Dalrymple, by the way, because Luke Dalrymple worked at it nearly full-time, single-handedly, all the time. We were doing classes and other things. He was pounding nails up there.
After a year and a half, he had literally converted that barn. And that's the reason why they named it for a hired helper here, instead of naming it for some noted person in education or something. Luke, who probably didn't have much formal education, but he had a lot of common sense and tremendous carpentry, so they decided to name the place Dalrymple Home.
And it's nearly a one-man job. Of course, the students and faculty did put a lot of effort in on that building, but it was a year or two. I don't remember exactly how long it took. And then that was suddenly available, and of course that doubled or tripled our available space. And as you know, I moved into the dark corner there.
Part of the curriculum, the students were part of a work program in which we did a lot of the maintenance of the buildings, and that was part of our way of acknowledging that this was a cooperative effort.
They put me hammering nails, and I probably fell off the building, and then they didn't know what to do with me, so they gave me the little pegs in a bucket and told me to peg, the maple trees for maple syrup, because they were making maple syrup. But since I was brought up in Kansas, I hadn't been aware of too many trees, so I pegged all the trees. The elm trees, the oak trees, the maple trees. And Roland Boyden, I remember, came behind me and pulled all the pegs out. So they decided I was not too good at any of those things, so then they had me wash buckets.
And he tried to get the students to help, and of course they'd get all excited about it and have a great time gathering sap. And just about the time it came to do all this work, come along spring break, they'd all go home. So it nearly always ended up that the faculty did all the work during spring break. And the program died for that very reason. I think pretty much the trustees bought it from the college and used it in promotion. You give us $1,000, we'll give you a pint of homemade syrup.
It was our college, and we hammered the floor down in the dining room, and and you dug the ditch for the septic. I remember there's some pictures of that still around. So that together, there was a very cohesive, I would say, a very cohesive group of individuals living there.
It was very rough and simplistic. We all eventually got our carpentry boxes up there to build things and make the place go.
Some of the painting, just painting the sides of the building. Nothing major at that time, and of course everybody had to work in the kitchen. There was a regular duty, a roster that everybody had time doing that. And there's usually ongoing things. I can remember the sidewalk, and you could hardly walk by it without stopping a few minutes and working on it. And then if you had to go somewhere, drop your tools and somebody else would be doing it.
There were many fields, but it was a lot of forest. And there was one road that did not go beyond the college.
The story was about how Dr. Hendricks went down Moss Hollow one day in mud season and ripped the oil pan off his car. So they sort of shook their heads and say, doesn't he have any sense about these things? But Moss Hollow was in much worse shape in those days, as were all the roads.
Cars were very primitive. If you were lucky and you had a pre-war Model A, you were in good shape.
Yeah.
Because it was high and you could get around.
They did pave the parking lot. I think not pave it, at least leveled it. And the road between here and the 9 all the way down was not paved. And in fact, from the road from South Pond up to here was really in terrible shape. Hendricks had petitioned either the state or the town, I forget which, to pave the road. And they put a road counter out, and we were under solemn obligation every time you went down the road. You had to back up 3 or 4 times. The kind of Ted. I don't think that we didn't end up enough to have it paved. It was not paved in the time I was there, but that was not officially rigged at town meeting, but it was rigged anyhow.
In some way, persuaded the authorities that to put a rudimentary blacktop on the road down as far as the sharp turn, the right angle turn, and they were so proud of that. But it was a very thin layer, unsubstantial, and when the first winter mud came along, it got muddy underneath some of this pavement, and it began to break up, and it washboarded it terribly, and they couldn't do anything about it. When it was a dirt road, they could grade the thing, but now that it was this blacktop, the blacktop was in ruins in some places that especially down in this dip.
There are many more buildings, and the road has changed. It's much easier to get around. But it still evokes that wonderful sense of arrival when you see that extraordinary view to the south.
I see physical change. I see a lot of new buildings. I see some beautiful things that are happening. The library addition and all of the things, amenities that make it more attractive to prospective students.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think in purpose that's the physical entity of it. In purpose of its goals, of its philosophy, I don't think Marlboro's changed. I think it's still working in the same avenues that it did way back many years ago.
The impression I have is that Marlboro is still a relatively free, somewhat unstructured educational institution, but much less so than that used to be the case. There was an attractive aspect of Walter Hendricks, which was that if you came up with an idea which you felt somehow should be incorporated into curriculum or whatever, you went and had a chat with him, and chances are he would say, well, let's give it a try, and that is still in some measure true.
The type of people that came to the Dick Judds, the Roland Boydens, the John MacArthur, those people that came and were part of it in its development, and then as it started to grow, and obviously always seems to be on the brink of financial crisis.
He spoke to Whittemore, and right away, because the Whittemores were summer friends. We connected up with them when we were very young, and would go walk from here over to South Pond and meet them at their cabins and go swim together pretty much every day.
It's an interesting board of trustees. See, Walter knew a hell of a lot of people. He was an English professor at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. He had a hand in the developing operation of the Biarritz, the University for GIs in France, Biarritz, France. And he summered here, and he was in Chicago essentially, but he knew a lot of people in the arts. He had a role with Farrar, Straus Publishers. In fact, they had a line of books they called Henry's House.
Whittemore, early along, Arthur was approached to be chairman of the board, and I don't remember whether it was here in our house or over there that around their table that my parents talked to Arthur and Suvie about the idea of the college. And I recall my mother quoting Suvie and saying, "Oh, what a wonderful idea, Flora. We'd thought of maybe getting an old people's home started here, but a college, this is really marvelous," and so forth.
I do have a unique perspective on Arthur because he was a wonderful father-in-law, and because I had lost my own father, just a couple of years before World War II broke out. He served as a substitute father for me, in addition to his merits as a family leader and so on.
Arthur moved forward as chair of the board with the sense of a lawyer and of a certain position in terms of attitude about money and order. And my father was an immigrant son who made do and started on shoestring.
It was fun for him to be chairman of the board of the smallest New England college, and attend meetings and meet distinguished people from all over in consequence of this. there's no question, I think, that he extended his range as a college trustee considerably, although he was in any event a wise and learned man, I would say.
I think there were many people in Brattleboro, like Z. Persons and others who were on the Board of Trustees who really supported the college financially and emotionally. And there were friends. The Whittemores had been summer people, and Arthur Whittemore was chairman of the board. His daughter was Sue Judd. And they gave, there were many summer people who gave unstintingly to the college and supported musicians when they came to get the music school started and so on. But Walter Hendricks had a genius for attracting people.
We got Rudolph Serkin, who lived over here in Guilford. He got Dorothy Canfield Fisher, the poet, Dorothy Thompson, an author. Wilhelmer Stephenson, the explorer. Robert Frost, that was a biggie there.
When my father got together with Frost, there were always reminiscences about personal friends, mutual friends. Then at some point during the day, he was presenting the idea that he wanted to start a college, and Frost's great surprise, but also not surprised. You know, he expected, in a way, my father would do something like that, and was asking him what kind of college it would be. My father was, describing some of the vision and the ideas of what he saw. My father was elated. The whole, just a wonderful glow, and Frost was delighted. Yeah, see, because after this announcement, my father was going to start the college, and then discussion of education and what a college should be, and Frost putting forth his ideas, and my father putting forth his ideas and thinking. And no, it's not going to be an Amherst, it's not going to be an Ivy-covered college, it's going to be something else. Frost was saying, well, what do you want of me? And my father was saying, well, would you be a trustee? Because my father was feeling that a board of trustees should be people of ideas, that this was the resources that he wanted to tap into in addition to money.
It was certainly Serkin and Persons, and I'm pretty sure it was Bush. They incorporated the school, and he was the treasurer, the first treasurer. And that's why I met with him. He and Paul Olson were the two local people here, the contact with the community, and that's why I met with him initially. And so I had a long relationship with Z as long as he was on both boards, as was Paul Olson.
We revered our professors, namely Roland Boyden, Dick Judd, Paul Zenz,
MacArthur.
John MacArthur. And things in those days were very shaky. So we all had to kind of pull together and make this work as best we could.
I came here the second year, and people came quite frequently after. Actually, I say frequently because those old years sort of run together. But when the GIs began to graduate, the enrollment of the college went down low. The first year of the college there were 50 students. The second year there were 100. And then it began to decrease slowly with normal attrition and graduation. And what was the lowest it ever reached? 20-some-odd students?
Yeah, 20-some-odd.
It was
15 faculty.
Yeah, it was very, very low, with a roughly 2-to-1 ratio. And there's no way we could ever understand how the college kept afloat. But anyway, when there were so few students, obviously we wouldn't be hiring very many new faculty. But as soon as there was the first sign of enrollment beginning to pick up, we hired quite a few new faculty. And I don't know exactly when Halsey came, but came essentially the same time. The Moises came, and Dick Judd came the year after I did. Roland had been here all along.
Roland Boyden was an ex-Navy officer and a very erudite guy on British economic history and stuff like that.
He had a sort of a natural feeling for what the student was or was not understanding and drawing information out of the students. He was good that way. He was here, well, you know, he had a summer place up there where his wife still lives. And I guess he was one of the first people that Walter talked to when he was considering running this college. So Roland was in on the ground floor there. He was probably the first faculty member hired.
I would guess the dean and English teacher, Roland Boyden, probably was the most significant educator that I remember ever having heard, and he just inspired people to do things that they otherwise would not have done. He ran seminars in his home, seminars on when the good weather occurred out in sunshine on the grass.
And that's what constituted the seminar, was a dialogue. And Roland was smart enough to ask really brilliant questions that got people talking and got people debating and raising various perspectives. And that was a way to get students to move between dualistic thinking to more complex ways of thinking. And I think that probably still happens there.
You know, I just remember in his class of being able to, he could make you, there'd be 6 or 8 or 10 of us in the class, and he was able to pose a question and then just be silent and wait.
And if you'd done your homework, you would
painful. He could, but and you know, he was just very, very challenging.
Back in the beginning, Roland used to give a wonderful course in ancient history and so forth. And ironically, we used to have great debates that used to involve the whole college, because the whole college would be 55 students or 70 students or something. And Roland was the leader of the Herodoteans, and I was the leader of the Thucydideans as great historians and so forth.
He had, I don't know how to describe it, it would then have been called left-leaning views. And during, when would it have been? The last couple of years that Walter was here, I think he decided that he was too far left-leaning. I don't know if it was the beginning of the McCarthy era or what. Yeah. But anyway, he fired him. So he was gone for a couple of years.
Okay.
And then as soon as Walter was gone and the trustees realized what they had lost, they hired him back.
He was asked several times to take on the job of being a full-time president. He preferred to call himself the administrator rather than the president.
Why is that?
Well, I think he felt that to call himself the president would have been a bit pretentious given the size and scope of Marlboro College.
You always knew that if Roland was around, it was going to be okay as best. And he also made a very, very fabulous martini.
Bob Carrie's house, I think, one of them didn't have electricity yet. Electricity had not come up that road on the South Pond yet. And you'd go to class in his house, and it'd be by kerosene lamp and around the fireplace, and then his wife would serve brownies and stuff like that. There was I think that because of the town meeting style of government, there was a great deal of interaction between the students and faculty.
Bob Corey was a hard one to take a class with because his voice was so soft, he put you to sleep. And my roommate Henderson and I used to take turns taking his class because we couldn't keep awake.
I think of Dave Lovejoy, who I think was the acting president or president one time. Roland Boyden, Dick Judd. Judd was my counselor, and I was an English major.
We went to Dick Judd's house many evenings, to finish up what we were discussing. We'd be in a real debate in there, and he'd say, well, why don't you have supper and come on down? And had an understanding wife that we shared him with kids all the time.
I taught what Walter needed to have taught. There needed to be someone teaching a course, well, teaching literacy, really. I mean, we had some first-rate students, but we also had some bums. So anyway, there was a required freshman literature course, which set out to be more or less a course in American literature, but became a lot of other things as we went along.
I remember one guy came directly from a big Midwest university, and his first day at class, he came in and we were all there, and I can remember guys with their feet up in the chair next to him, laying back, stuff scattered all around. I guess a couple are smoking. And he walked in and he said, "Is this a class?"
Other than the fact that the professor was at the head of the classroom teaching you, there was no real differentiation between them.
By and large, the academic level, of course, to me, coming out of high school, I thought it was pretty good, because Paul Zen's the anthropologist, and his courses, he'd assign a book a week per student, and then we'd discuss it in his house. And his wife would serve hot cider and so forth. Never booze.
And everybody liked Paul Zenz a whole lot as a teacher. He was apparently a very good teacher. But then he became president, and he didn't have as much time to teach, and people were very discouraged about that because they really wanted him back as a teacher.
I think the faculty was as interesting in their makeup as a student body was, where you gathered these people from. Ted Goodwin taught chemistry without a lab, and he was a high school chemistry teacher, and one of the things he must have taught was he taught someone how to make a Calvados out of ordinary cider out in the woods. So sometimes those guys in the coffee cups weren't drinking coffee in class; they were drinking hard cider, which they managed to brew up in a cider mill, but back in the woods here someplace. But it was an inventive group of that sort.
I was taking an advanced math thing, and it was probably 4 of us over a cup of coffee in the morning, and of course the big thing was to have our little alcohol toddy and our coffee while we were sitting in class. And it was like, a lot of the classrooms were not very big. I mean, you couldn't take more than about 8 or 10 people in a classroom at the time.
We were all underage, but somehow there was always, and the faculty offered you booze. You went to Roland's house, you got scotch. I got a bottle of Valentine's scotch for my 18th birthday, which Mark drank. It was a different kind of environment in lots of ways, and from what I hear about now.
I enjoyed very much having the small classes, and I mean there were 5 in our graduating class, and Bruce and I comprised 2/5 of it.
Yeah.
Bridget Bennett now is Bridget Gorton, and Audrey was her mother, and she taught Spanish, English novel.
Audrey was she was a fiery woman and loved English literature and had incredible prejudices. I went to her memorial service, and the guy who'd been the theater person for a long time spoke about one of the few characters Audrey really liked was Lady Bracknell, and the importance of being earnest, which will tell you lots about Audrey. She was extremely outspoken, and she was very widely read, so that she made wonderful connections and helped us try to make those connections too.
I admired her very much, and she was a really good teacher. Interesting. Personal relationship with every single book, and felt very strongly about everything and was good at communicating that. But she had her eye on Buck Turner as being her permanent escort everywhere, and she did not have it together for him to fall in love with somebody else. So there was a lot of strife.
Audrey Gorton wanted to write a book on the venison. And in order to do so, she knew a lot about how to cook various cuts of venison. But she decided that there really ought to be a chapter in there on how you turn the deer into a bunch of cuts of venison. She didn't want to do it, so she got Buck to do it for her. And Buck didn't want to do it alone, so he got me to join him in the venture. And one night, late at night, he called me on the phone and said, "All right, we have the carcass, we're going to cut it up." And so, and this was down in the bottom floor of Dalrymple, in one of the little rooms down there. He had dragged the deer in, and we marked it up and cut it, and I kept notes while he did the cutting or something. I don't even remember exactly how it worked. And made notes, and we didn't take photographs or anything, but we made drawings and things, and it went into her book. This was strictly illegal because it was in the middle of the winter, it was way out of season.
Audrey had been a model for me because she got her BA at Marlboro as she was teaching. Now think about that in this tenure-ridden world.
Zenz, Boyden, Judd, all built houses, and also, still can't remember the math teacher's name, built that little house there, so there were faculty around. Oh, and Halsey Hicks, of course, and Buck Turner. Buck and Tinky lived at the house which is just beyond Baget's on the left.
He'd been a Marine in the Second World War. He was very casual. He did surveying during the summers. I think he actually was a town surveyor at one point. And Bridget spent a summer with him as an assistant, traipsing through the woods of Marlboro, or the boundaries of Marlboro. I spent a lot of time with him outside of the college. He and Tinky were building the cabin, and I spent a great deal of time helping him with that. Anything for a free meal.
He was a protege of Halsey Hicks. He has his degree in forestry, but with Halsey teaching here, he didn't really need to teach forestry. His interest was in geology, or as much as forestry. So he taught, I think most of his work here was teaching geology.
Taught some math, too.
And I was just going to say, we had trouble getting mathematicians here in some of those days, and Buck taught quite a bit of math.
I remember I had been taking a class with Buck Turner because mathematics mystified me. Well, what he did was take me from 1 and 1 is 2 all the way through to, we were doing spatial trigonometry. And I was fascinated with all of this.
He was really himself kind of specializing in math by then, and things that John MacArthur wasn't teaching. He would teach a course in some abstruse kind of math, like non-Euclidean geometry or something. And he often taught, for the English class, would go in for a month and teach Icelandic sagas.
He had, I guess brewed is the right word, a bunch of Applejack that he thought was pretty good and was going to be really high quality if it could be distilled. And the distilling process meant, of course, putting it in some kind of a container with a tight lid, and then that putting the vapors off into a condensing coil. Well, he asked me if I had any ideas. Well, he had come up with a pressure cooker that you could use, because of course they do close up pretty tightly, and he'd rigged up a way to hook copper tubing to the place where the pressure relief valve normally would be. And he knew that I happened to have just bought, for other purposes, a coil of copper tubing. So we set this thing up on my back porch with a fire under it, started it boiling, and hooked the copper tubing to it, and rolled it down out across my field. and sat and kind of waited anxiously till it began to boil. And then when it finally began to work, here was the end of the copper pipe coming down across the field. We would lie down underneath it with our mouths open and taste a few drops and then let the other guy take a few drops. It was what you call raw. Aged about a fraction of a second. But it was good.
The senior MacArthurs were there at that time, and they were very prominently known geneticists. And then their two sons were eventually on the faculty in the field of science, and yeah. And then they married, and then the grandchildren are all around down there now. We used to push in strollers, I guess, that type of thing. So it was a great family group.
My father died in 1950. I guess you knew that. He was only actually active here for 2 years. Walter made him dean of everything right off the bat, and I guess the combination of that plus a full teaching load plus working on the house in Newfane and everything was just too much for him. He caught a nasty virus, and it doesn't matter. He didn't make it. So that left us without a biologist. They scrounged around and found people to try to take over, and none of them lasted very long. So they asked my mother if she could do it, and she said she would like to, but she didn't feel qualified. And it was hemming and hawing, and she agreed that if she sort of studied up a little bit, that she might give it a try. And I don't know exactly when it was that she finally decided to give it a try. Must have been the mid to late 50s, I think. I took her a few years to get around to it. She commuted from Newfane, they're living in the old farmhouse there, and decided that was much too hard, so I built her that house on South Road, where Felicity is living now, I guess. And she lived there the rest of her life. She died in 1970. So there was a long period of time when she was the biologist here.
So I worked with John MacArthur's mother, Olive. Mm-hmm. And yeah, she actually, when we first knew that we were going to have our first child, I told Olive first rather than my mother and your mother. So it was a kind of a warm relationship there, and she gave me her loom and taught me how to weave. And so when she was dying, and she had given me the loom that she had woven so many things on, and so that was kind of nice. And I still have that.
I didn't actually take a course with Olive, but I liked her, and I liked talking to her. Yeah. And she had a way of bringing you into the scientific world without intimidating you and making you feel that you had something interesting to know and contribute. Yeah. And I think that was true of all the faculty. They weren't there to tell you how smart they were. You knew that. They were asking you into the conversation, and that's a very different way to be.
I just felt, that you could, of course, talk to them at any time, and they were right there for you a lot. And they were as friends as well as I shouldn't call them peers, but in a sense they were the same. Mm-hmm. John MacArthur isn't that much older than we are, actually. 10 years maybe.
Always accessible. But, they're always available for you.
You go to their house or call
there
them.
Was
first name basis, of course. Yeah. And they were exciting to study with because they were learning things as well.
John MacArthur, he was neat. He taught the math, and he erased the blackboard as fast as he wrote on it because he had so much information. He'd get a whole equation written up before the class, and then as he's talking about it, he's got to add, so he's starting to erase. Nobody could keep up with them with their notes, But he was very handsome and charming and warm and friendly.
And then we commuted with the MacArthurs, and that's when we would come over in an open Jeep in March and April, which was freezing cold, and because they're great nature lovers, and the brother became one of the leading ornithologists, I believe. And they'd hear a bird tweet, and they'd all leap out of the car and disappear for 45 minutes. And we would sit in the car just for 45 minutes, so I dreaded hearing a bird tweet for quite a long time in my life. Now I like birds. It took me a long time.
People often ask me, well, you know, you've been there 50 odd years. Why do you stay at the same old place for such a long period of time? And my answer is it isn't the same old place. It keeps changing. Every generation of students has their own characteristics. The GIs that were here in the first few years are just nothing like the bunch of protesting students that were here in the 60s, or the relatively quiet, well-behaved students that are here now. They're just totally different generations. So it isn't the same college.
We had a comprehensive exam that we had to pass, so we didn't have we had tutorials after that, after
Nothing,
the sophomore
nothing is
year.
the plan that you people are.
No, we did have to have
Blessed with.
area of concentration.
We had, at the end of the year, we had generals. And you had to pass all of them in order to move on, which I didn't do. But those took up about a week or two, and they were very intense.
As more and more students came, and more students were taking the examination, it took a huge gap out of the year for the faculty to correct the examination. Of course, there were the usual arguments that it's unfair to evaluate somebody on a set of examinations at one point in their career, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My own experience was that nobody who flunked the examination was in fact ready to go on.
The whole place was like inventing itself as it was going along, and this sense of, there were these dreams, and there were this collection of people and ideas, and you made things happen. And the first commencement was in the field down below the parking lot there. And the field just went down. Platform got set up and the people sat in folding chairs in the field or sat in the grass. And at that first commencement, Frost was a speaker, Dorothy Canfield Fisher came over, Ernest Gibson, who was governor of Vermont and became a good friend of Brattleboro, and my father made a lot of contact with him. And Charles Cole, who was president of Amherst, and Hugh Mulligan is the first graduate.
Life magazine, of course, as you remember it, they had a picture of the nation's largest graduation, the University of Southern California, about 2,000 graduates, and had nation's smallest graduation, and it was Marlboro. Then he had a picture of nation's smartest graduate, some kid at MIT. Then they had the picture of nation's only graduate, and they had a picture of me.
Everybody, I felt, worked hard for five days, and then Saturday night was the night to go to Brattleboro and play. And if if the town and the college had been the town at the top of the hill and the college at the bottom, and you were going downhill to go home, none of us would be alive probably today. But the beaters that we were driving in those days, you had to come up that mountain in second gear a lot of the time.
I had a car. It was a 12-cylinder Lincoln. And we used to coast into Brattleboro. And then I put 50 cents worth of gas in it to get it back up the hill. And very often the guys had to push it over. In West Brattleboro, there was one last hump. If we didn't make that, they had to push it.
And I can tell you, it's from here to Brattleboro, it's all downhill.
Yeah.
You can coast, you literally could coast, you get out on the blacktop, and you could coast all the way to Marlboro.
There was one student, for example, I guess I'm using the word loosely, who had been an explosive expert during the war, and his favorite thing to do was to light a stick of dynamite and shoot it up into the air with his bow so that it would explode up high. Well, it was evidently very satisfying to him, but it kind of disrupted things around here.
And he'd get somebody to light the thing, and he'd count 1001, 1002 as we were all diving under cars and all. And then it would blow at the top of the arc, and it sounded like 4th of July, you know, the big boomers. Well, he would do that. So he let a couple of those go off, and all of a sudden we saw Walter Hendricks come out of his house, and we took off up across there, and the first guy didn't get the doorknob turned and blew the latch and all right off that main door and the thing. And we all ran upstairs and dove into those little closets underneath, and water came flying up through there, and there were some guys studying, you know, you've seen so-and-so, some guys come in here, no, I haven't seen anybody before. And he never did catch us, but that put the double whammy on that for a while.
Anyway, there was a little bit of that in many of them. They'd been in the Army for quite a few years, most of them, and that was an experience. I mean, not an experience, it was a class of people, I guess, that I hadn't had much experience with. So that was odd to me. They were, many of them, older than I was, because some of them had been in the Army for 4 or 5 years. That didn't really bother me. You know, I felt a little funny at times, but it didn't really bother me because I knew my subject and I knew they didn't, which was why they were here and why I was here, so it worked out all right.
Most of us were ex-GIs, ex-Navy, and as we were saying last night, no one ever talked about the war. There were no war stories, no one ever talked about what their experiences were. Even last night I didn't find out that a troubled student we had, a guy named Dick Murray, who was always in trouble and a heavy drinker, really had gone through some very ghastly combat experiences, which is why he was. And we never knew that because you know, I guess they all wanted to get on with their lives, and the military was something past.
One student who was there when I came, the first in his family ever to go to college. He worked his way through college digging graves on Staten Island and so forth. And then there was another student a few years later whose brother and father had all gone to Exeter and Harvard, and he was damned. He'd been at Exeter. He was damned if he was going to go to Harvard. So you got these two extremes.
Coming to Marlboro, you could get an education, or you could goof off if you wanted to, or you could get a partial education, and or you could become a learned fellow in some field. So it was all things to all people, really.
I was the first member of my family to go to college, and so I thought it would be a nice step, you know, an extent. Natural, well, because of this prep school I went to, it was taken for granted. You go to college, and the mindset was there, and I really wanted to go to expand my life, and I think it's helped a great deal. I don't think I would have ever gotten the persona, I should say, of what I wanted in any other school.
Now, no one in my family ever went to college. Neither my mother or father graduated from high school. So I think all of us came from that kind of background. Without the GI Bill, we would not have gone to college. And without Walter's starting a new one, a lot of us would still be waiting to get into Amherst, I suppose.
In the early years, our students tended to fall into two categories. There were the serious students who were capable, and there were others who could have been serious students who preferred to drink bourbon and raise hell.
I enjoyed a good time, and I will say I enjoyed most of the classes up there, all of them actually. The instructors were good, it was informal, it felt like I was learning things.
And I think that the caliber of the kids has remained. There's an interesting group of kids, whether it was way back then or coming in now. It seems like Marlboro attracts interesting characters.
My roommate, Bob Thompson, and I went with Tinker Howell, Bob Howell, like his name, to a cave in Arlington, Vermont. We brought back 6 baths, and we had them in the room for about 2 weeks. It was kind of neat. This thing would fly around your head with a knife. And Roland Boyden heard about it. He came in and he said, "What in the hell did you guys do?" So the bats were gone.
On the way back, there was a good-sized deer out in the middle of the field.
Yeah.
Just happened to have my gun in the car, and so I stopped and wound the window down. And it's not necessarily the most admired way of hunting, but anyhow, it was effective, and I shot, and the deer went down. And but I was afraid the game warden would be coming along, so I'm probably incriminating myself.
there's a statute of limitations.
Yeah,
You're safe.
Okay, and so I got the heck out of there and came back crack of dawn the next morning, and the deer was there. And so I cleaned it up, prepared it, and brought it back to school. And I believe we had some on the menu here.
I remember putting a toilet commode on the top of Dalrymple's chimney. I don't know if that's been done recently. Also, if you go into the administration building, I don't know if that's the administration building now, as you come up to it's that little building.
Admissions.
Admissions. There were only 2 people that ran the college at that point, and we somehow got the key to the place, and there was a trap door in the first floor, and we went in one night and moved everything respectively downstairs. We opened the trap door and put everything neatly down underneath in the cellar. So when they came in the next day, they came in, opened the door, and there was just an empty room.
I remember one instance where it was 25, 30 below zero, I told you. And we lost our power. We had no heat, no electricity. And so there was a big fireplace in the living room. So we all gathered in a semicircle in blankets and sleeping bags, trying to study with kerosene lamps and candles and flashlights. And then shortly after that, we heard that the students at Princeton University had rioted because they lost their maid service. And so, quite a contrast.
It was informal and friendly, and we had a party now and then where the deans at more established institutions might not have approved. That is to say, booze flowed.
We would get our own apple cider and whatnot, or sometimes buy it, and you'd freeze it. It got pretty cool, in the wintertime up here, and it would freeze. And so when cider freezes, which has some alcohol in it, eventually the ice forms on the outside, but the alcohol doesn't freeze. So the alcohol it keeps concentrating until you have a container with, and it could be a glass, just an old glass jug, with liquid in the middle, which was like 100 proof alcohol. And then we'd mix it with whatever we were mixing it with, and it was fine. We had some good parties.
We were all members of what was called a 5220 club, and you got $20 a week for spending money out of the GI Bill for 52 weeks for a year, and that type of thing. And so, we tried to save as much as we could, but we'd spend a couple of bucks on Saturday night for a few barleys down there. And I used to take a jar of salamanders with me because the head of the limnology department said those things are basically protein. I asked him whether you could eat them, and he said, "Oh yeah, they're delicious." So I'd go down and bet the guys to set me up with beers if I eat a salamander. So I was able to wolf down a salamander and get a couple of freebies sitting on the table.
But a bunch of us started a basketball team, and we bought our own uniforms. We didn't have a gym, so we used the community center in Brattleboro. During the season, we never practiced. The practice was a game. The school gave us, or loaned us an old Oldsmobile, and had no windows in the back. And that was our means of transportation. And I remember going to play North Adams State, and we went over Hogback into Brattleboro. It was about 15, 20 below. And we were freezing. So unfortunately, the first thing we did when we got to Bennington was to stop at the nearest bar to warm up. And I remember looking at the basket, and it was... I think I did pretty well, because all I do was shoot at the one in the middle.
There was a lot of focus on studying. I mean, obviously we had parties, and that situation existed then as it does now, I'm sure. But obviously much more going on now in the recreational aspect. We didn't have an outdoor program such as now. We had our own ski tow, though, which you guys don't have now. On the left as you come, right near the parking lot, down near the music building, we had our own truck engine and a ski tow.
We slid down hills on trays out of the dining hall. We went skiing all over the place. I mean, when you go skiing to various faculty houses because you need to get something to eat.
I remember going off Mathers. I was on the third floor, and we'd come off in the winter. We'd come off the out of the third floor onto the roof of the L, and then slide down off the roof into the snowbanks. That was always kind of exciting. But nothing that was destructive beyond.
Yeah.
I mean, we could always put the things back upstairs, which we did. But there was a small enough group so that you were caught with anything you did anyway. You couldn't really escape.
Oh, I've got to tell you this one thing. This was so typical of Marlboro. What's the name? Ramona arranged a Christmas hayride. Oh, snow like nobody's business. So we all got in and we were going to sing and serenade the people in Marlboro. There are about 2 families, that's all. And we got down to the first family and we all started to croon or whatever carols or something that we were singing, and they all turned the lights off. And went to the second family and they did the same thing. Oh, I just howled. I mean, talk about inhospitable.
We had a couple of formal dances a year. And they were unfortunate, hokey activities, but, you know, the way formal dances only can be. Maybe you don't know, you never had to go to any. But it was a time when people put on, you know, dresses, suits and all that kind of stuff.
We had dances in the dining hall occasionally, and we'd try to get a date from somebody in town. There was a teaching hospital there with a nurses' quarters for nurses training. I used to date gals from that because they were gung-ho square dancers. they were a neat group and all.
We had a dance one time, and the girls came over from Williams and Bennington, Smith, Mount Holyoke, and there was a blizzard that night, and they got snowed in, so guys would double up in rooms and sleep on the floor in sleeping bags, and so the girls could come in. And Flora Hendricks patrolled the corridors, so our community remained celibate even during the blizzard.
When I went there in 1956, there were 35 students. I'd say about a third of us maybe were women. There were only men to begin with, but then women were included in the next few years.
Even the female cook looked good because of such scarcity of women.
I remember talking to Boyden later, and he said that he missed the GI students because they were original thinkers and asked the questions that the ordinary college student coming out of high school does not ask. And he said they had more inquiring minds and more original minds. And I hope that that's the impression that we made on the faculty, because Walter did gather a very interesting faculty.
One night, Dave Hersbrun started telling us about a dream he had. And he was talking about being chased, and he was being chased in a mountainside. And at that point, listening to him, I told Dave, stop right now. I'm going to finish your dream. And so I said, you're running on this cliff, getting away from whatever was chasing you. And the cliff was precipitous and inverted on the other side. And so you woke up before you couldn't jump because it would have been, and he couldn't get over it, neither could John Kohler, that I finished his dream. And that was the kind of closeness that we developed. So it was that kind of friendship. And backgrounds and religious orientation and so on never played a role. And that would be true of many of the students here. There was never any feeling of differences here. We were Marlboro College students, and it was a remarkable feeling in those early years.
If there were only 27 students and 12 faculty or whatever it was, that's just one big family. And I still remember a Thanksgiving dinner when we just had everybody together, the entire faculty, the entire student body. We all had sat down in the dining hall to one great big turkey dinner.
Walter Hendricks had to cut corners for keeping cash flow in hand. He had Z. Perkins of one of the banks in Brattleboro as treasurer of the organization at that time, and he was very supportive, providing advances on costs. The funds that were available from the government for returning service people were meaningful in getting the college started, of course, but never enough. And so Walter Hendricks had to cut some corners, and occasionally would get into a little difficulty with the trustees about spending too much on certain things and accounting for those things.
The thing that stands out about Walter is that he was also essentially the business manager here. Or I should use that in quotation marks too, because he was terrible at that.
Somehow or other, the end certainly justified the means in his mind, and we who were benefiting from the education we were getting from the staff that he assembled as teachers, we would kind of turn our heads the other way when there were charges that things shouldn't be handled quite that way financially.
Eventually, we had to have a meeting of the trustees and faculty without the president. He paced up and down outside like a caged rabbit or something, and they fired him. I mean, of course, many of us liked Walter. I always liked him. He was considered him a good friend and full of good advice in many respects, if not about how to manage your money. But so in other words, we were sad to lose him. And the thing that I felt even worse about was the fact that, as you point out, his heart was in the right place. His only real wishes were that this place should do what he wanted it to do and succeed.
He was always restless. He was somebody who got out of the car and started running before he fully stopped. You know, he was always on to the next thing.
But the financial problems in those early years, I must say we made a lot of excuses for Walter because he did maybe lie a little bit, but he kept the place functioning. And that's my memory and tribute to Walter, albeit he left an impression that he cut corners. But if he hadn't, I don't think we'd be here today.
I was in the town meeting the night that the students put Walter Hendricks on the auction block, and I couldn't believe what was happening, and that they felt that he should resign as president of the school, and probably 2 weeks later he was gone. There was a tremendous amount of argument back and forth and temper, anger, and then it seemed as the vote was taken, there was just a period of silence in there. And imagine Walter sitting there. He was sitting right in front of me, and just sat there rigidly, and probably went home to Flora and said things went bad tonight.
There were differences of opinion between him and the other trustees, I guess, as to what you could do with next to no money, which is what the college had. And having lived all his life with next to no money, he reckoned you did anyway. And they, having grown up in solid New England backgrounds, reckoned you had to have solid backing before you moved. And it's there that the conflict came. It was difference in concept. And he offered his resignation, I think when things got really tense, and they accepted it, which meant he lost his home and everything because he'd given it to the college.
He had this dream towards the end of World War II of founding a college, and when he got behind something, he gave it everything he had, and things would get ahead of him. And I guess we say that he has the claim to fame of having founded 3 colleges and then having to be removed from them through perhaps mismanagement or something like that. But I still say that the man was a genius.
But the whole experience of those 2 years and the year in between were, I would say, wonderful. I just loved it. And so Marlboro has always been very close in my affections.
I would say that it's a little more ostentatious than it was then. I think the same spirit is there, and certain independence of the students to pursue what they feel is important.
I think it's much more serious now than it was then, because the fact that it survived. We didn't think it was going to be last year, but it did. And I think it's fantastic that it's as active as it is today.
I want to say that I think so much about Marlboro, which I can't articulate for you, is deep in me and has made me the kind of educator that I am. Yeah. And the kind of, I had no intention of being a teacher. My mother was a teacher. I wasn't going to do that. And the sort of strands of my life came together when I realized that's what I needed to do.
Buck Turner summarized it. Someone said, asked him if Marlboro created leaders. And he thought for a minute and he said, no, I don't think so. The man said, why not? And he said, because we don't have any followers. And I think that summarized the whole tenure of the school, the student involvement. It was astounding that the students had much say in our town meetings.
The faculty, as diverse as it was just our version of the internet, putting us into learning in other directions. I don't think any of the lectures that we heard here were maxims for life, but the whole experience was. And I think that first of all, to enjoy it, because early Marlboro was fun, and I hope present Marlboro is fun. And then to profit by it, you only get as much out of it as you put into it, not what the faculty puts into it, but what you put into it.